I spent 3 weeks investigating 8 holes in the ground. That sounds stupid. Stay with me. Each one of these holes has the exact same file attached to it. Ancient people stood at the edge. They looked down, and they decided this was the entrance to the underworld. Not a metaphor, not a story for children, an actual physical doorway to the land of the dead. People built temples over these holes. Priests performed rituals here. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to stand at the edge of a hole in the ground. What I found, most people are never told. Every single one of these holes is still there. You can visit most of them today, and every single one has a real physical scientific reason. A reason birds drop dead near the edge. A reason priests came back from the hole speaking gibberish. A reason entire cities built their founding myths around a smell coming out of the ground. The gods never needed to be real for this to work. The ground just needed to be doing something nobody had a name for yet. Let's go underground. Here is how this investigation started. I noticed something connecting ancient ruins in Turkey, Italy, Mexico, Ireland, Iceland, Greece, and Japan. Cultures with zero contact with each other. Different gods, different centuries, sometimes different millennia entirely. And every single one of them built a sacred site over a hole, a cave, a lake, or a fissure in the ground, and called it the same thing. A door to the dead. I went looking for the source. Not the myth. The actual physical thing underneath the myth. What was really coming out of these holes that made grown adults, priests, kings, entire civilizations treat a hole in the ground like the edge of reality itself? Here is something else worth sitting with before we start. None of these places needed Hollywood. None of them needed special effects. The ground did all the work on its own. That is what makes this case file different from every monster myth I've covered before. This isn't about a bone someone misread. This is about a smell, a sound, a feeling in your chest that something underground was actively, deliberately trying to kill you. Sometimes it was. 8 field reports, 8 locations, every one of them real, every one of them still standing. Let's start with the one that is still killing birds today. Hierapolis, ancient Turkey, around 190 BC. There is a small cave here, barely big enough for one person to crouch through. The locals called it the Plutonium, the gate of Pluto, god of the underworld. Here is what they did with it. Priests would lead an animal up to the cave entrance and release it inside. The animal would walk in. The animal would not walk back out, every single time, without exception. But the priests themselves could walk right up to the mouth of that cave, lean in, sometimes put their whole head inside, and walk away completely fine. Visitors came from all over the ancient world just to watch this happen. It became something close to a tourist attraction, 2,000 years before tourist attractions existed. The ancient Greek geographer Strabo watched this happen in person around 2,000 years ago. He wrote it down exactly as he saw it. He even tested it himself. He threw sparrows into the cave. The birds dropped dead before they hit the ground. He described an enclosure around the cave mouth, just large enough for animals to be led inside, surrounded by mist so thick you could barely see the ground. For the ancient world, this was proof. This cave was the literal breath of Hades, killing anything that wasn't divine, anything that wasn't protected by the gods. The priests who survived it were treated like they had some kind of supernatural immunity. Some accounts even suggested their survival was connected to ritual castration, as if the gods only spared those who'd given something up. Here's what nobody told you. In 2018, a team of German researchers brought a portable gas analyzer to that exact cave. They found carbon dioxide pouring out of a fault line in the earth, sitting in concentrations up to 91% right at ground level. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It doesn't rise and disperse the way most gases do. It pools low to the ground, almost like an invisible lake sitting right where small animals breathe. A sparrow flying low, or a bull with its head down at ground level, breathes pure carbon dioxide and drops within seconds. A priest standing upright has his head 1.5 meters above that invisible lake. He is breathing completely normal air the entire time, even while his upper body is technically inside the haunted cave. The priests weren't gods. They were tall. That gas is still escaping from that exact spot right now. Today, as you are watching this, researchers in 2011 recorded birds and insects dying near the cave mouth in real time, the same way Strabo described it 2,000 years earlier. 2,000 years later, the Gate of Hades is still doing exactly what everyone always said it did. It just isn't a god. It is geology, quietly leaking out of a fault line that happens to sit under a tourist site in modern-day Turkey. Second location, a volcanic crater lake just outside Naples, Italy. The Romans called it Avernus. The name itself translates roughly to birdless. Tradition said any bird that flew directly over the lake would fall dead into the water below. The poet Virgil wrote that this exact lake was the entrance the hero Aeneas used to walk down into the underworld in one of the most famous poems of the ancient world. There is a cave nearby, called the Cave of the Sibyl, where a priestess supposedly gave prophecies straight from the land of the dead, channeling voices that weren't her own. Notice the pattern from Case 1 already showing up again, in a completely different country, centuries apart, with no connection between the two cultures. Sulfurous fumes. A volcanic region called the Campi Flegrei, the fiery fields, sitting directly underneath both the lake and the cave. This entire stretch of land sits on top of a collapsed magma chamber from an ancient supervolcano. The ground here is still hot. Sulfur gas still leaks from cracks in the rock today, exactly like it did when Virgil was alive. A bird flying low over a lake that sits on top of an active volcanic vent has the exact same problem as Strabo's sparrows back in Turkey. Toxic gas concentrated right at the surface, right where birds fly lowest and where the smallest creatures spend the most time. And the priestess giving prophecies in that cave. Same volcanic region, same gas seepage rising through cracks in the rock. A person sitting in an enclosed underground chamber, breathing in low-level sulfur and other volcanic gases for hours at a time, doesn't need to be touched by a god to start hallucinating, slurring her words, losing track of time, saying things she doesn't remember saying afterward. The Romans called it the breath of the underworld. The actual breath belonged to the volcano underneath them the entire time. It had been breathing long before the Romans arrived, and it is still breathing now, just a short drive outside modern Naples. Here is where my investigation got genuinely interesting. I wanted to know if anyone back then suspected the truth. The answer is, some of them clearly did. They just used what they found instead of explaining it to everyone else. Delphi, Greece, home to the single most famous oracle in the entire ancient world. A priestess called the Pythia sat on a tripod inside an underground chamber and delivered prophecies that kings, generals, and entire city-states based their futures on. Wars were started or avoided based on what she said in that room. A priest named Plutarch, who actually worked at this exact temple for years, wrote that a sweet-smelling vapor would rise up from a crack in the floor of that chamber right before the Pythia entered her trance state. He described her voice changing completely, her body convulsing in ways that frightened the people watching. Sometimes, he wrote, she would die within days of a particularly intense session, and a new Pythia would have to take her place almost immediately. For over 1,000 years, nobody questioned what that vapor actually was. It was simply accepted as the breath of the god Apollo, rising up from the earth to speak through her. In 2001, a team led by geologist Xibalba found 2 active geological fault lines crossing directly underneath that temple, intersecting at almost the exact spot where the Pythia would have sat. They tested the spring water nearby and found light hydrocarbon gases, ethane, methylene. Ethylene has a distinctly sweet smell. It was actually used as a real medical anesthetic for decades during the 20th century, and in small controlled doses it produces a floating, euphoric sensation, along with significant memory loss afterward, almost identical to what ancient writers described happening to the Pythia. That description lines up almost exactly with the accounts left behind by people who actually witnessed this in person. Scientists are still arguing today over the specifics, whether it was specifically ethylene or possibly a mix of methane and carbon dioxide, simply cutting off oxygen in that small, sealed underground room. Either explanation points to the same basic truth. The room itself was the drug. The temple had been built directly on top of its own intoxicant for over 1,000 years, and nobody needed to fake a single prophecy to make the whole system work. Now here is a location where I found something genuinely different. Not just a gas leak that fooled people by accident, the way it did at the first 3 sites. An actual deliberate hand-built operation designed specifically to convince people of something that wasn't true. The Acheron River in northwestern Greece. Ancient Greeks believed this exact river physically flowed straight into Hades. At its source, archaeologists found the ruins of something called the Necromantion, the Oracle of the Dead. People would travel here specifically to speak with their dead relatives. Real conversations, with real answers coming back from beyond the grave, according to every single visitor who made the trip and lived to tell people about it afterward. The historian Herodotus even recorded a detailed story where a man consulted this exact oracle to ask his dead wife where she'd hidden a sum of buried money before she died. Here is what actually happened to a visitor who made this journey. First, weeks of total isolation, away from family, away from normal food, away from sunlight. A strict ritual diet that, according to records, included plants with narcotic properties. Then, a long walk through a pitch-black underground labyrinth of corridors, getting more and more disoriented with every turn, more and more sleep, deprived after days of preparation rituals. And then, in the final chamber, archaeologists excavating the site found something the ancient pilgrims themselves never got to see. Mechanical lifting devices, crane systems built directly into the stone walls. The exact same kind of theatrical machinery used in Greek theater productions to make actors appear to fly above the stage during a performance. A pilgrim who hadn't slept properly in weeks, who'd been fed mildly hallucinogenic plants on a strict schedule, who would just walk through total darkness for hours on end, would then watch a human figure apparently rise straight up out of the floor in front of them, lit by flickering lamplight. That wasn't a dead relative crossing back over from the underworld to answer a question. That was stagecraft, built by hand, by actual engineers, operated by a priest standing concealed behind a wall, pulling a rope at exactly the right moment. The most unsettling part of this particular case isn't that ordinary people believed it. It is that someone, somewhere, sat down and deliberately designed this illusion on purpose, and it worked convincingly enough to fool visitors for centuries straight. Not every case on this list involves trickery like that one. Some of them are simpler than that. Sometimes the ground itself just genuinely looked exactly like what people already believed was waiting down there. The Yucatán Peninsula in Mexico has no rivers at all on its surface. None whatsoever. The entire region sits on top of porous limestone, and over tens of thousands of years, that limestone has collapsed in literally thousands of separate locations, creating natural sinkholes filled with impossibly clear, still water. The Maya called these sinkholes cenotes. To the Maya, these weren't simply water sources for drinking and farming. They were physical, literal doorways to Xibalba, the underworld described in their oldest surviving texts. Divers working in modern times have recovered jade, gold, pottery, and human remains from the bottom of these sinkholes, clear evidence of centuries of offerings made directly into what entire generations believed was the actual mouth of the afterlife itself. Here is the part of this case that is almost too clean to believe. Geologists now believe many of these specific cenotes sit along a massive ring shape, caused by the exact same asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The force of that impact fractured the limestone bedrock in a huge circular pattern stretching across the peninsula, and over millions of years, water slowly carved out an entire hidden river network underneath the jungle floor. So the Maya weren't actually wrong that something enormous, violent, and incredibly ancient had shaped the land beneath their feet. They simply didn't have the scientific concept of an asteroid extinction event from 66 million years in the past. What they had instead was a hole that dropped straight down into clear, cold, completely silent water with no visible bottom whatsoever. Anyone standing at that exact edge, in any century, in any culture, would feel like they were staring directly at something that didn't belong to the world above ground. Let me bring in the final 3 field reports together now, because by this point in the investigation, you'll already see exactly where each one is heading before I even finish explaining it. Station Island, off the coast of Ireland. Pilgrims here would fast for days, then spend a full night sealed inside a tiny stone chamber that was believed to be the literal entrance to Purgatory itself. What actually happened inside that chamber is consistent with something called a sweathouse, a sealed, smoke-filled enclosed space that was used elsewhere, across Ireland purely for medicinal healing purposes. Total sensory deprivation, combined with several days of fasting beforehand, reliably produces vivid hallucinations, even in completely healthy, otherwise rational people. No food, no light, no sound, for that many continuous hours, and the human brain will manufacture its own visions to fill the silence. Hekla, in Iceland, a volcano so consistently violent that medieval Europeans genuinely believed it was one of only 2 physical entrances to hell anywhere on Earth. After its first major recorded eruption in the year 1104, it buried more than half the entire country in volcanic ash within days. Sailors out at sea reported hearing actual screaming sounds coming from inside the crater itself. That screaming was almost certainly the sound of escaping volcanic gas under extreme pressure, but to a 12th century sailor with absolutely no concept of plate tectonics or magma chambers, it was simply the only explanation available that fit what he was hearing with his own ears. And Mount Osore, in Japan, an active volcanic caldera filled with bubbling acidic lakes and sulfur vents that locals still call jigoku, meaning hells, to this exact day. Buddhist pilgrims continue to travel here in the present day specifically to mourn their dead, because the landscape itself physically resembles ancient descriptions of the underworld found directly in Buddhist scripture. Nobody needed to invent that resemblance through imagination. The sulfur and the volcanic activity did that work entirely on their own, with no human help required. 8 locations, 8 cultures with 0 contact between them. And every single time, the same basic set of ingredients shows up, just in slightly different combinations depending on the location. Toxic or hallucinogenic gas, escaping from a geological fault somewhere underground, sensory deprivation, or extreme physical isolation, sometimes deliberately engineered by human hands. and a landscape that physically resembled whatever that particular culture had already imagined the underworld to look like, long before they ever found the actual site. Nobody had to lie about any of this. The ground itself was doing something genuinely strange, in a way absolutely nobody at the time had the scientific tools to properly explain. A hole that kills small animals but somehow spares tall humans standing upright. A vapor that makes you see things you can't otherwise explain. A landscape that looks scorched and otherworldly because it actually is, geologically speaking, still mid-transformation right now today. Calling all of this a god's doorway wasn't stupidity on anyone's part. It was genuinely the most accurate explanation available for people who were working with the only information they actually had access to at the time. 8 holes in the ground. 8 separate civilizations who looked at the exact same kind of physical evidence and reached the exact same conclusion completely independently of each other, thousands of miles and sometimes thousands of years apart. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of one of these places, you are not actually standing next to a myth anymore. You are standing next to a fault line, a gas vent, or a sinkhole that has been doing exactly what it is doing for thousands of years before anyone bothered to give it a proper name. This doesn't spread on its own. Share it with someone who genuinely needs to know. Next time, I am investigating something hiding in plain sight inside your own kitchen, right now as you are watching this. One object, one question that, as far as I can tell, nobody has ever actually answered for you properly. That investigation is coming soon. Out of these 8 locations, which one would you actually want to stand next to in person? Tell me down in the comments. I read every single one.